This is the most expensive model that I've ever bought. Not the most expensive ever, it's not some kind of world record, but it is for me. I have built and painted a whole heap of Tanith First and Only models over the last few years. Many are conversions and kit bashes, but there are a handful of official models in there as well. There's the plastic command set: Gaunt, Corbeck, Rawn, Bragg, McColl and Larkin. I painted these and tried my best at the time to paint them as well as I could. They look alright. But there's also the old metal set, sculpted by the Perry brothers in 2002. Gaunt, Corbeck, Larkin, Milo and Dorden, as well as 5 generic models, including one of the women of Vervenhive. At the time I painted these, I wasn't nearly as proficient a painter as I was when I painted the plastic set, and there is one more officially released Games Workshop model set of the Gaunt's Ghosts that I haven't shown before on the channel. It is the rarest. Only 1,000 ever made, officially, so 20 years later on, they're pretty rare and hard to find. But this is the Black Library Gaunt's Ghosts diorama. It features 2 figures, Gaunt and Corbeck, and a scenic tiered base. Corbeck has 2 pieces, a big lump of most of him and a lasgun with his hands. Gaunt, however, is just a single piece. And the 4th and final piece is the scenic base, a muddy lower tier with a dead cultist hidden inside, and a mechanical platform with a little detail. The previous owner of this example has cut down and polished some of the mould lines, which I've seen some terrible example of the mould lines on this particular model before. Gaunt stands pretty stoic, pointing his bolt pistol and the sword of Hieronymo Sondar low at his side. Corbeck also stands ready, lasgun pointed at waist level. I can easily imagine Column charging forward, firing wildly from the hip, but this is just him standing. It seems like a movie poster when the characters walk up and then stand and pose for the photo that will become the poster. It implies all of the action around it, but without showing it directly. The characters are confident, taking a pause, and ready for the next bout. Well, I keep seeing this diorama show up on Gaunt's Ghosts groups. Oh, look what I found! I got a great deal! I'm gonna protect this and hide it away! Just nobody wants to paint the damn thing. Everyone's all like, oh, I'm too scared to ruin it. As if you can ruin a model with paint. Especially a metal model, acetone will take that right off. What you can't do is put the mould lines back on, and so I'm gonna set about ruining this collector's value piece by finishing the cleanup work and getting the piece built, and I'm gonna break out my good brushes to get some paint down. It has annoyed me for so long that so many people get this very rare set and then refuse to paint it, and it feels so good to start painting my own. Maybe showing up those people wasn't worth what I paid for this model, but still, I will be painting mine. I do want to do a good job, and so I'm going to break out all of the tricks and techniques and spend as long as I can to paint this model. And I'm not a fantastic painter to begin with, and even though I've learned some things over the last few years, I'm still not going to be Instagram famous with this model. There are 2 techniques that I'm going to start using straight away, and they are thinning my paints with inks and shading around the colour wheel. My cloaks here are obviously green, as with my whole Tanith army, and I usually start with just a dark green and go to a lighter green, but this time I'm shading around the colour wheel and introducing just a little bit of dark blue into this first layer. This will add a subtle boost of colour whilst remaining dark, hopefully making the piece as a whole more visually interesting. But I wasn't just adding blue paint, but rather blue ink. And as I come to my first layer of highlight, I'm actually adding some yellow ink in as well, forming a green ink that I'm using to thin my green paint with. When you thin with only water, you reduce the proportion of medium, making the paint apply more smoothly, but also reduce the proportion of pigment, making it more translucent. And this is fantastic and really useful for a lot of techniques but there are of course other ways. By thinning with ink like I am here today, which are very thin in terms of viscosity, this then thins the medium in the same way that water does, making it very easy to apply smoothly. However, ink has very high pigmentation, higher than even most of the paints, and that boosts the vibrancy of the paint even when it's a dark hue. For a last highlight, I'm going to use my light green paint, thinned again with this green mixed ink, and this mix is lighter than the earlier layers, but not as light as most of my cloaks in the rest of my army, where I used just the green paint thinned with water. I did go back and forth in a little dilemma over what camo pattern to use. I have the rest of my army in this fleckle pattern, and I quite like that look for tabletop models. It's very easy and quick to do, and looks the part, but it isn't quite kind of nice enough for a display model. Now, I did end up using my flecker pattern, as you can see here, but I'm certainly considering repainting the cloaks of these two, maybe with something closer to S95 DPM or something else that's a more presentable camo pattern. Well, for the moment I'll leave it like that, and I'll move on to the uniforms of the two models, which generally is a very quick and simple part of my Tanith models, but I'm going to at least try to make them look as good as I can. The Corbett model got a black paint thinned with a black ink, and wow, does that look dark. This is certainly something to keep in mind if I ever need a really dark black. I mixed a little grey into this mix to give my first highlight colour, and I went fairly thin, but I covered quite a lot of surface area of the uniform, and this acted almost like a mid-tone rather than a highlight. And when I went for a much stronger highlight in a bit more grey going in there, I went with a much smaller area, and this is somewhere between a cell shade, an edge highlight, and just an outline. It's fairly simple, but because I've got such a deep dark black and a relatively light grey, I'm getting much more contrast than I usually do with my Tanith uniforms. For Gaunt's Stormcoat, I went with a very similar method, starting with black paint and a blue ink, bringing just a little cool vibrancy into the shadows of the cloak. The next layer, strangely, has black paint and black ink, and what this means is that the most recessed shadows are actually slightly lighter than the mid-tone around it, and we can see how that looks at the end. The red sashes of Gaunt's uniform also got a very considered and slightly different order of paints and inks. Firstly, a red paint and a brown paint mix, and this is to pull the red into the middle of the colour wheel so that the shadowed part of it looks very dull. For the mid-tone and then highlight, the red paint got a red ink mixed into it, which I think made it a little too thin in some places, and it ended up pulling like a wash would, and I didn't want it to do that, but I let it dry out and had another go, and for the most part this came out quite well. For the yellow trim, I went to my old technique of underpainting in pink. On top of that, a single layer of yellow paint and yellow ink makes for an extremely vibrant, almost cartoonishly primary yellow. And this always looks pretty vibrant, but adding the yellow ink as well, oh wow, it's even more obnoxious than normal. I wondered for a while if I should use a brown wash to let this down a little, but in the meantime I dropped Corbeck and broke his lasgun off. I also then lost the lasgun. Yes, I lost a piece of the most expensive model I've ever bought. Whilst this sucked, I certainly wasn't happy about it. I channeled my unchannelable rage into painting the parts of Corbeck behind the lasgun, his chest and his arms, pretending that I was just doing a subassembly. In fact, for painting his skin, I'm trying something new, base coating with purple. Human skin, generally speaking, has blood underneath it, And as skin is a translucent sort of material, you do get hints of that red or purple showing through. It's not as strong as the purple paint I'm using, but let's at least try it and see how far we can get. Rather than just using the purple by itself, I mixed some of my Caucasian skin tone paint in with the purple, and over several layers I build up the shape quite slowly. Skin has always been something that I don't paint that well at all, especially when it comes to faces, so I was willing to spend as much time as I could conceivably use to outweigh my lack of ability. No rushing, just deliberate, slow and methodical. Whilst I had those paints out, I painted Gaunt's skin with the same steps. My brush abandoned me part the way through, O ye of little faith, but I pressed through with careful, deliberate, slow and methodical steps, and ended up using a replacement brush for quite a lot of that as well. Once I finished all of this, I moved on to another area, quite distinct part of the model. When I painted the plastic Gaunt, I tried an underpainted effect on the sword, and then painting blue ink over the top. Unfortunately, the ink wasn't quite translucent enough for the way that I underpainted, so I'll try again and see if I can do better this time. Painting with black and white to shape an undercoat of where I wanted the colour to be, I tried with that blue ink again. This time I had the ink thinned with water, making it very thin, but it worked to an extent, and I do have the underpainting showing through. Just for that last little extra touch, a nice tidy white edge highlight and some minor cleanup makes the sword stand out quite nicely. And all that's left is the base. Now I could easily ignore this and dry brush it once and call it done, but the sculptor went to quite the effort here, and there's a lot of bits of detail to see. The tiled upper floor reminded me of something, and it wasn't till I sat down to actually paint that I realised. It's that dirty, tiled shower block from the movies, the cream tiles that are grotty and filled with grime. And I immediately wanted to replicate that. And to do that, I hit this with a tan paint first, and then a dry brush of an off-white. But to bring the dirty, grimy look, I used a collection of washes. I used my inks to make custom washes, and I started with a brown wash over the whole thing. And I made sure that I applied enough that it would both tint the tiles and fill the grout lines, but so thick and heavy that it's going to leave some tide marks and other dirty effects as well. But I wanted this to be a bit more varied even than that, and so I tapped in some of my black ink wash whilst the first layer was still wet. And this let them mix and seep into each other for some slow, gentle gradient of colour, but it gives the dirty, patchy look that I was after. A simple metallic for the rest of the upper floor was all that was really needed, and then for the cultist body deep in the mud. For most of this third character of the set, I used the leftover paints from the wet palette. The brown and red mix that started Gaunt's sash became the blood-packed uniform. The cream from the tiles became his skin, and the gold I used on the shell cases became his golden emblem. Now I wanted to paint the cultist up before I did the mud, because any of the messiness of the mud will just make the cultist look even more half-buried and dead for ages. That said, the mud was the easiest part of the whole project. Dark brown with a light brown dry brush, and that's it. You might notice that not only is there a lot of brown on the base, similar to my other Tanith models, but there's no inks here. And what that does is it let the figures on top stand out with vibrant hues as well as being brighter, but without leaving the base as a no-effort, boring lump. Overall, I'm really happy with this, and it stands, as I painted it today, one of the nicest models I've ever painted, which just goes to show that I'm hardly a competition winning painter. But I am really happy with it, and I'm glad that I have spent the quite a few days to paint this set. So let me know in the comment section below what you think of my painting of this extremely expensive and very rare model. I probably, in fact almost certainly, will never own a model of this cost ever again. In fact, this one set costs more than most kind of starter sets and even several armies that I have, so it's not something I can really afford to buy regularly. But as such a rare model that's hard to find, and given that most people who buy these are kind of just wanting to own it and hide it away somewhere and never paint it, well, I'm glad that I've got at least one out of the 1,000 that were made painted. But I am subtly trying to improve my painting skills. Now, I'm not a competitive person, and so I don't care about winning awards or like aggressively becoming the best painter ever. It's just one of those things where I've been painting for so long that I really want to paint some nice individual models rather than kind of dry brushing and washing whole armies at a time, which is what I've been doing for the last few years. And over the course of the many models I paint for the rest of my life, I will certainly improve. But if I compare this to my original Gaunt that I painted quite a few years ago now, you can see that I have come a long way. And even compared to the plastic Gaunt, which I also painted a couple of years ago now, but not quite as long ago, you can certainly see some improvements. But that's a lot of nattering and meandering. I have a very cool and very expensive project completed now, so thank you very much for watching. I'm ED-SKaR, and I always will be.